This lesson, titled The Family Tree of Sin or the Hamartiological Tree, hamartiology is the study of sin, so that's why. This lesson, we will look at what is probably, if not absolutely, every sort of sin that is condemned directly or somewhat indirectly in the Bible and how they relate to each other. Really, if we got into all the nitty gritty on how they relate to each other, this would be more like a fourth or fifth dimensional Venn diagram, but try to keep it more simple like a family tree. Before we get into that, though, I want to make sure that the purpose of this lesson is upfront and clear. This lesson isn't to say that I'm better than anyone else. Just, I'm not saying, oh, you're a real sinner because you do all these things, but, no. I, no, I need this lesson as much as anyone. All right. I'm learning from this lesson like you watching. And in fact, instead of saying that you're worse than me, so I'm better than you, I'm actually saying, no, you're as bad as me because just like me, you are a sinner in need of the Savior. Also, this lesson isn't to push people into works righteousness. I don't want anyone watching this lesson and then thinking, oh, I got to make sure I do all these good works to make up for these things, or oh, I got to make sure that I'm by my own power not doing these things, not committing these sins so I can earn my way into heaven so I can be good enough to get into heaven. No, it's to do the opposite. It's to help us see how much sin Jesus died for, including our own, and see and love the truth and necessity of sola fide, sola gratia, or gratia, however you pronounce it. To see like, oh wow, I am so sinful. Wow, Jesus had to die for a lot just for me. Yeah, the only way I am getting saved is by God's grace, and the only way I can receive that is simply through faith in Jesus. Faith as living. One more thing before we get into the individual sins is, first of all, what is sin in the first place? Well, it's not to be confused with temptation. That's a different thing. Sin, it is all wrongdoing and lawlessness, as it says in 1 John 5:17 and 3:4 respectively. So it is violation of God's moral standards. Hence, every sin is ultimately against He who is eternal and therefore deserves eternal punishment, just like crimes against the federal government deserves federal punishment. And sin separates us from having a good relationship with God, as it says in Isaiah 59:2. And sin is a work that earns and causes death. First part of Romans 6:23 and second part of 5:12 say, for the wages of sin is death, and death spread to all men because all sinned. And then also, by the way, just so you know, you only have to commit one sin to be a sinner, just like you only have to commit one crime to be a criminal. James 2:10 says, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of it all. Now, these are the major kinds of sins we will go over. The sin of idolatry makes up the trunk of this family tree because all sins come out of this one. And it is false religion or the worshiping of something that isn't the living God. Exodus 20 verse 3 says it's a violation of the first commandment, and Colossians 5:20 and 1 Corinthians 6:9 say that those who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. And within idolatry is false ministry. It is acting as a minister of God, but without actually being born again, or really being a true faithful servant to God. Deuteronomy 18:20 says that ancient theocratic Israel had the death penalty for false prophets, which would be a type of false minister. Also within idolatry is heresy, which is a gospel-contradicting false doctrine or belief that is denied as being such and taught as true. 2 Peter 2:1 says that these are brought by false ministers. 1 Timothy 1:10 says that whatever is contrary to healthy doctrine is what God's law is for, to expose. And Galatians 1:8 says that declares anathema for any being, human or angelic, that preaches a different gospel. And so that means to have the curse of God upon them forever, to suffer eternal damnation. Also in idolatry is false communion, where it's partaking of the communion, but without first becoming born again and examining yourself. And 1 Corinthians 11:29 mentions how, at least in the past, maybe still happens today, some people have gotten sick as punishment for taking false communion. Not everyone who took false communion, but some people who took false communion and were punished with illness, even death. Then also within idolatry is the making of idols, which is creating something physical or imaginary to worship instead of the living God. And Exodus 20 verses 4-5 say that this is a violation of the second commandment. The sin of sorcery also fits within idolatry. And yes, sorcery is real-ish, meaning probably not the way you think. See, sorcery is occultic, pagan, mysticist, or New Age activity or practice. It is the trying to do or be involved in supernatural or spiritual things in a godless way. Deuteronomy 18:10-12, ancient Israel had the death penalty for a list of such practices. Galatians 5:20 says people who practice these things won't inherit the kingdom, and Revelation 21:8 says those people also will have their part in the burning lake. It's pretty bad. And also, by the way, sorcery can get you demon possessed, so don't do it. And whether you believe it still happens nowadays or not, at least in the past, that's how people got possessed by demons, is through sorcery. So yeah, don't do it. And it includes occultic / pagan images, markings, or trinkets. Trinkets don't even have to just be idol statues, just any sort of physical object that represents a part of a cultic, pagan, mysticist, New Age kind of thing. And an example of cultic markings is in Leviticus 19:28, where God forbids Israel, God forbids them cutting themselves for the dead or getting tattoos, as in reference to pagan tattoos, like pentagram. Also within sorcery is curses, and I don't mean swear words, I mean actually trying to invoke supernatural misfortune upon someone. James 3:10 says blesses and curses coming from the same mouth ought not to be. And Romans 12:14 says to not even curse your persecutors, but in fact bless them instead. Also within sorcery is spirit contacting. This can take many forms. You have Ouija boards, seances, or speaking to what you think are dead relatives, but if someone's replying, then it's probably actually a demon in disguise. But yeah, speaking to dead relatives, that's spirit contacting. Don't do that. Because yeah, you might actually be talking to a demon in disguise. First half of Leviticus 19:31 says, do not turn to mediums or necromancers who form spirit contacting. Then often overlapping with this, also within sorcery, is future predicting, which also includes many things, such as fortune telling, astrology, not astronomy, astrology, tarot, like with tarot cards, or interpreting omens. You go, oh, it's a sign. No, it's not. The second half of Leviticus 19:26 says, "You shall not interpret omens or tell fortunes." And finally, within sorcery is blood consumption. The first part of that last verse from Leviticus says, "You shall not eat any flesh with the blood in it." And some people think, well, no, that's actually a ceremonial law, like not eating certain meats. But the reason Israel was forbidden from eating this, from eating blood, from consuming it, is because back in Leviticus 17:11 through 12, the reason you don't do it is because the life of the flesh is in the blood. Blood is sacred. Consuming it is not treating it as sacred. So it's a problem, and that's actually why blood consumption is sometimes part of sorcery, because it's a way of not treating it as sacred. And also, not consuming blood doesn't just show up in the Old Covenant. It shows up in Genesis 9:4 when God is talking to Noah, the representative of all mankind at that time. He says, "But you shall not eat flesh with its blood." The sin of selfishness also makes up the trunk of this tree, like idolatry, because like it, all sins come from it. Really, all sins come from a combination of selfishness and idolatry, because whenever we sin, it's acting as if we are God, which got a whole lesson on that later. And so selfishness is the putting of yourself first and what you desire first in some way, shape, or form over something that should actually take precedent over. And 1 Corinthians 13:5 says that selfishness is contradictory to love. And Proverbs 16:18, probably heard this before, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty or selfish spirit before a fall. Within selfishness is narcissism, which is self-love. Yes, it is a sin to love yourself if you are loving yourself more than something you ought to love more than yourself. It is a sin to kind of be in love with yourself. Shouldn't hate yourself, but yeah, like your spouse or your kids, definitely shouldn't be loving yourself more than them. And 2 Timothy 3:2 says, avoid narcissistic people. Also within selfishness is conceit/arrogance. It is having an overly high view of oneself, such as self-righteousness, where you view yourself as more moral than you really are, like calling yourself a good person. You're not. You, like me and everyone else, are sinners. And then there's also self-superiority, where you think yourself as superior or better in some way than you really are, which could be outside of morality. This is also mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:2 and in verse 4 as well. Also, Mark 7:22 says it is an evil that defiles a person. 1 Corinthians 13:4 says that this too is contradictory to love. Proverbs 6:17 says God abhors it. And Romans 1:30 says that people who practice this deserve death from God, because it's you're making yourself as God, or at least putting yourself up higher than you really are, which is a big problem. And it can manifest itself as boasting, which is excessively proud and self-satisfied talk about what one has or is. It's also mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:2, 1 Corinthians 13:4, and Romans 1:30, and James 4:16 says boasting and arrogance is evil. The sin of disobedience is failure or refusal to obey an authority or leader and its rules and commands, such as disobeying God, family, and or government, such as in the cases of smuggling, tax evasion, or other civil crimes. 1 Timothy 1:9 says that the moral law was made to expose the disobedient as sinful. Exodus 20:12 says dishonoring parents is a violation of the fifth commandment. 2 Timothy 3:2 and Romans 1:30 says to avoid people who are disobedient to their parents, and the latter says that such people deserve death from God. Romans 13:2 says that resistors of governing authorities are resistors of God. First part of 1 Peter 2:13 says to be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Ephesians 5:21 through 22 says Christians are to mutually submit to each other and wives are to submit to their husbands. That is, respect and follow their leadership position. And 6:5 commands servants and slaves to obey their masters, but for Christ's sake, to do so as a slave of Christ. Not because the Bible says slavery is good. Get to that later. And then in Acts 5:29, Peter and John said that they must not disobey God above all else. Sin of impertinence, word earlier used. This is also another root of the tree. It is insolence, rudeness, lack of courtesy, special regard, and respect, and really just overall being a real jerk. Romans 1:21 and 30 say that people who practice this deserve death from God. And 1 Timothy 1:13, Paul says he used to be like this before being born again. And included within this is ingratitude, which is, not being thankful or appreciative. Also mentioned in 2 Timothy 3:2, avoid people like this. And Romans 1:21 says, ingrates toward God deserve death from him. And you may think, whoa, death for just not being thankful? That's pretty intense now, isn't it? Okay, but wait a minute. But if God gave you life and you're not going to be thankful to him, what's so wrong and outside of his jurisdiction to then take back his gift of life that he gave you, if you're going to be so ungrateful for it? There's also railing, which you see mostly just in King James and old translations like that. It is abusive, reproachful, insulting speech. 1 Corinthians 5:11 says, don't associate with so-called Christians who practice this. And 6:10 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. There's also derision, which is contemptuous, ridicule or mockery or taunting. Psalm 1:1 says, blessed are those who don't walk in the scoffer's way, scoffing being a type of derision. First part of Proverbs 19:29 says, condemnation is ready for scoffers. And second part of 24:9 says, the scoffer is an abomination to mankind. Wow. And Jude verse 18 says, in the last time or the last days, nearing the end of time, the end of this world, there will be scoffers. And what will they be doing? They'll be following their own ungodly passions. And also within impertinence is irreverence, which is specifically a disrespect towards something that's taken seriously. Psalm 36:1 says transgression or lawlessness speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, which would be an example of irreverence. And 1 Timothy 6:20 says avoid the irreverent babble. The sin of Sacrilege is a specific type of irreverence. It is specifically disrespect/disregard for what's considered sacred, and not just taken seriously, but taken as sacred, especially religiously. And this takes two major forms: desecration and blasphemy. Desecration is an act of disrespect of a person or thing that's religiously esteemed. So an example would be like defacing something, vandalizing something, whether it's a building, a statue, or even uh, making an image of something that's religiously esteemed and putting it in positive association with something against that religion, like trying to make Saint Sebastian a gay icon. That would be an act of desecration. Like drawing him with a rainbow flag behind him. I mean, like, oh, it's a great symbol of it. No, that's desecration. Another example, desecration would be the false preacher Mike Todd pouring syrup and putting other food on a Bible in a so-called sermon. It's damaging a Bible, which is religiously esteemed. That's desecration. Some other examples of desecration, Psalm 74:7 says, they profane the dwelling place of God's name, bringing it down to the ground. So like destroying the temple, that is desecrating it or profaning it. And Exodus 31:14 says that not keeping the Sabbath, when back under the old covenant, not keeping it that way was profaning it. And then blasphemy, this is, instead of an action, a verbal utterance, like taking God/Christ's name or title in vain, or treating it with disregard. Like, for example, saying OMG, like actually what that stands for, and using it in a irreverent context. Exodus 20 verse 7 says that this is a violation of the third commandment, and God won't hold such violators guiltless. And 1 Timothy 1:13, Paul says he used to be like this, used to be a blasphemer before becoming born again. And some people think, well, what's the big deal? Well, taking anyone's name or title associated with them, like, for example, president, in vain, or, using it as a cuss word, that is incredibly disrespectful, because you're treating the person's name or title, and therefore, by extension, that person, him or herself, as meaningless. You're not giving it due honor, so you're disrespecting that person. Sin of malice is another root. It is desire or intention to do evil, whether in general or specifically. Ephesians 4:31, 1 Peter 2:1, and Colossians 3:8 say to put it away, and Colossians 3:5 says don't stop there, but put it to death. And then Romans 1:29 says people who practice this deserve death from God. The sin of lovelessness, this is another root sin. It is kind of self-explanatory, a lack of love/compassion for a person or godly thing, just having not even sympathy. And it includes synonyms like, heartlessness or cold heart or hard-heartedness, insensitivity, ruthlessness, and contempt. 2 Timothy 3:3 says, avoid loveless people, and Romans 1:31 says, loveless people deserve death from God. The sin of bitterness, getting into our branches, it is unnecessary antagonistic disliking. It is selfish resentment, and it includes grudges, which are basically chronic bitterness. Hebrews 12:15 says, see to it that no root of bitterness springs up. Kind of ironic. Ephesians 4:31 says, put it away. 1 Corinthians 13:5 says it contradicts love. And this can progress into sinful hatred, which is passionate dislike, namely toward God and things of him, including those made in his image. So this includes self-loathing. I earlier said that loving yourself is sinful, well, so is hating yourself. 1 John 3:15 says, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, because sinful hatred is internalized murder. Continues, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. And Romans 1:31 says, those who murder, those who practice hate or hateful, they deserve death from God. Because, again, it's internalized murder. This can progress into irritability, which is being easily frustrated and short-tempered. Again, we have Ephesians 4:31 and 1 Corinthians 13:5, and Colossians 3:8 says to put it away, and Galatians 5:20 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. And this can progress into hostility, which is unjustified anger with and unkindness toward something, and this includes vilification/reviling. And Matthew 5:22 says, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And then this can progress into implacability, which is being uncalmable, unforgiving, unappeasable, and irreconcilable. And 2 Timothy 3:3 says to avoid people like that. The sin of brutality stems from these things that we've just gone over, and it is savage violence or great cruelty toward a person or what we'll call high-level animal. Like violence against a cat or dog or cattle. That would be brutality, but I mean, killing a fly isn't. Proverbs 12:10, it says, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. 2 Timothy 3:3 says, avoid brutal people, and Romans 1:31 says these kinds of people deserve death from God. And then brutality can advance into its absolute, which is murder. And murder is the unjustified taking of human life, anywhere from fertilization to just before the person's death, and whether it's against yourself or another person. Unjustified taking of a human life is murder. And this can come from bitterness and things that stem from bitterness, or it can just come from simple lovelessness. Exodus 20:13 says it's a violation of the sixth commandment. 1 Peter 4:15 says Christians shouldn't suffer as murderers do. Mark 7:21 says murder is evil that defiles a person. Proverbs 6:17 says God abhors it. And Romans 1:29 says people who murder deserve death. Genesis 9 verses 5 and 6, God says to Noah, who is the representative of mankind at the time, quote, and for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. So you take a life unjustly, you deserve your life taken from you. And Revelation 21:8 says murderers will have their part in the burning lake, which is called the second death. So you deserve first and second death if you murder. And Exodus 21 verses 22 and 23, no matter how much you try to manipulate with the original language, it says that in ancient Israel there was the death penalty for striking a pregnant woman and causing the person inside her to die, whether the child dies inside or comes out and dies as a result of injury. That's what it says. And it wouldn't make any sense to even bring this up if it only said that it's only murder if you kill the woman. It's like, well, there are already laws that say if you kill someone, life for life. So why bring up a specific instance with a pregnant woman? Because it's saying the life in the womb has equal value. It's that if you take the life of an unborn person, it's murder. And murder also includes human euthanasia, aka assisted suicide, at least to some degree. Now, I don't believe I know enough to say that, yes, there is absolutely no situation whatsoever where it can be acceptable to speed up a person's dying, put it that way. Like giving them extra morphine to the point to where they die. I don't think I know enough to be able to say absolute that it's always wrong to ever do such a thing like that. But at least in most cases, and just about all cases, it is sinful because, first of all, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 8, second part of verse 8 says, "So no one has power over the day of his death." Why? Because it is God alone who decides when a person dies or not. So to euthanize a human being is to then play God. And if you want to say, well, but the person's suffering, well, suffering is a part of life. Romans 5:3 says, "But we rejoice in our suffering because knowing that suffering produces endurance." Suffering can produce a good thing, even though it itself is not good. So you could be robbing someone of their suffering producing endurance. And then 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose." So that suffering, and so the person suffering could be part of God's perfect and good plan for that person if that person is in God. So, to say, well, it's okay because the person's suffering, well, but suffering is a part of life. It's like, well, then if you can say, well, I can take the person's life because they're suffering, then you could take anyone's life. Don't we all suffer at some point? I mean, especially if it's for something petty, like euthanizing someone because they have hearing loss. We should all be able to agree, yeah, that is sinful. The sin of substance abuse is the intentional or reckless improper intake of a substance, namely some sort of drug, food, or beverage, that directly causes bodily harm and, sadly, in some cases, death. So, like, for example, taking hard drugs, that would be improperly intaking a substance, whether intentionally or recklessly, and thereby causing harm to your body, if not death. Another example of substance abuse is gluttony, which is an overindulgence of food or beverage, whether alcoholic or not. And Proverbs 23:20 says, "Avoid gluttonous people." And within gluttony is drunkenness, which is excessive consumption of alcohol to the point of being drunk, at which point your body is being harmed by that overconsumption of alcohol. This is also mentioned in Proverbs 23:20, and 1 Timothy 3:3 says a church leader mustn't be a drunkard. In Galatians 5:21 and 1 Corinthians 6:10 say that drunks won't inherit the kingdom, and 1 Corinthians 5:11 says to not associate with so-called Christians who are drunks. Now, I know some people might be saying, well, what about people with addiction? They can't help themselves. Well, addiction, though, is an excuse. It's not a moral pass. Even if you could actually find that there is some physical cause for the addiction, it doesn't then all of a sudden make it morally okay, right? Now, you could struggle with it, but again, it doesn't make it right. Like, especially men and plenty of women too, struggle their entire life with lust, but it doesn't then mean it's okay if they do lust. Doesn't mean you have to marginalize or hate people with these struggles, of course. The sin of omission / non-action is refusing to and avoiding doing what is right to do. James 4:17 says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." And Romans 7, Paul speaks about struggling with not being able to do what is good because of sin in his flesh preventing him from doing it. Some examples of sins of omission are over leniency, like a failure to do justice, like a judge just letting a violent criminal go or go on very low bail. There's also circumspection, where you are absolutely avoiding any risk in all cases. There's also sloth or laziness or idleness. That's idle, IDLE. This is total avoidance or reluctance to work, make an effort, or be active, or just be involved in activity. This can be absolute, or it can be selective, where it's, all right, you'll put in a lot of effort to do what you want, but if someone asks you to do a favor, you'll seriously drag your feet. Proverbs 15:19 contrasts a sluggish person and an upright person, meaning these are two different kinds of people. 18:9 says, "Whoever is slack or lazy in his work is a brother to him who destroys." And first part of 21:26 says, "The desire of the sluggard or slothful person kills him." As it leads to your spiritual destruction, to your desire to be a sluggard. Also, in the second part of 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul commanded this to the Thessalonians so that they wouldn't be slothful. He said, "If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Which leads to the playing out of the first part of Proverbs 21:26. That destruction from being a sloth. You're not working, so you're not eating, so you're going hungry. And also in 1 Timothy 5:8 says, "But if anyone does not provide for his household," listen to this, "he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Wow, that's strong. Another form of a sin of omission is lukewarmness, which is spiritual apathy, a lack of zeal. It is passively not seeking to serve God while not what we would consider aggressively and actively opposing God. The second part of Romans 12:9 says, "Abhor what is evil and hold fast to what is good." So if you're not doing those two things, that would be an example of being lukewarm. This is a big deal because Revelation 3:16, Jesus says that he will spit out lukewarm people. That is a frightening thought. Speaking of fear, some sins of omission come from cowardice, which is willful refraining from doing what's right, or it's denying what is right, or something that is, and especially if it's difficult, dangerous, or unpleasant to do or acknowledge what is right. And as cowardice comes out of worldly fear of worldly consequences. And the first part of Proverbs 28:1 says, "Wicked people flee in cowardice." And Revelation 21:8 says, "Cowards will have their part in the burning lake." Sin of injustice is unfair, unequal, arbitrary treatment of others and or rules. And this includes unproportional punishment or just total failure to punish, like over leniency, And it includes applied identity politics like DEI/DEB. It also includes bribery, which is using an offering to persuade to act favorably in an unjust way. Exodus 23:8 says, "And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right." Amos 5:12 says it's a great sin, and Proverbs 17:23 says the wicked accept bribes, and in doing so pervert the ways of justice. There's also hypocrisy, which is applying inconsistent arbitrary standards. 1 Peter 2:1 says to put it away. Romans 2:3 says hypocrites won't escape God's judgment. And 2 Timothy 3:5 is just one of many verses that specifically condemns religious hypocrisy. Like the many times that Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites. Also, there's judgmentalism, not merely making judgments, but judgmentalism, which is having or displaying an excessively critical point of view, which is sometimes even based on faulty reasoning. And Matthew 7:1, when it says, "Judge not lest ye be judged," is saying don't be judgmental. And also within injustice is oppression, which is prolonged unjust treatment or control. And this includes marginalization and extortion, which extortion can almost be thought of reverse bribery, because instead of paying someone to do you a favor, it's forcing someone to pay you so you do them a favor. And the first part of Zechariah 7:10 says, "Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor." First part of Proverbs 14:31 says, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker." And 1 Timothy 1:13, Paul used to be an oppressor before being born again. Of divisiveness has many overlaps with injustice. We'll get to a major one later. But divisiveness is tendency to cause disagreement or unfriendliness or opposition. 1 Timothy 3:3 says church leaders mustn't be divisive. Galatians 5:20 says divisive people won't inherit the kingdom. Titus 3:9 says divisive people are sinful and self-condemned. And Jude 19 says worldly people who are devoid of the Spirit are divisive. Divisiveness can often come from stubbornness, which we'll get to a bit later. And divisiveness can progress into dissension, which is disagreement that leads to discord. And Galatians 5:20 mentions dissension as well. Now, discord is disharmony or strife and tension that arises when two sides disagree. And Proverbs 6:19 says that God abhors this. And then strife is bitter, sometimes even violent confliction or dissension. And so you see a cycle repeats. The first part of Proverbs 17:19 says, "Whoever loves transgression or sin loves strife." And Romans 1:29 says, "Strifeful people deserve death from God." Probably thinking that that's pretty intense, but strifeful people probably strife with God and people made in his image, so. And these things can all be involved in factionalism, which is dividing into rivaling subgroups, mainly over non-essential issues. And like in 1 Corinthians 1, that whole chapter is about Paul telling Christians to not create petty Christian factions. It's like, all right, you say you follow Peter, you say you follow Paul, you say you follow Apollo. La-di-da, don't fight each other over that. Sin of prejudice is a major overlap between injustice and divisiveness, as it is preconceived bias that is not at all based on reason or actual experience. And this can be just being specifically favorable to one side, which is favoritism, or it can be just specifically being unfavorable to another side or group, which is discrimination. And prejudice could also, other words, it can be put as unjust, unfair treatment that's based on and furthers divisiveness. Hence how it's an overlap between injustice and divisiveness. James 2 verses 3 and 4 say that giving someone greater or lesser treatment for selfish reasons is judging with evil thoughts. And verse 9 says, quote, but if you show partiality or favoritism, you are committing sin. And then the first part of Leviticus 19:24, God commanded ancient Israel to treat sojourners as they would natives, to not discriminate between the two. The sin of foolishness, aka folly, is, to be clear, different from ignorance, because this is lack of wisdom or grasp on reality that is caused by self-delusion from sin. And this most commonly comes in the form of denying or just willfully not being able to understand honestly basic laws of logic like the law of non-contradiction. And some examples of common philosophies of today that embody this are relativism, post-structuralism, transgenderism, postgenderism, and most of all, atheism, as the first part of Psalm 14:1 says that only fools are atheists. Which is true, because science says a God must exist. Now, first part of Ephesians 5:4 says that there should be no foolish talk, since it's out of place. Mark 7:22 says it's an evil that defiles a person. And Romans 1:31 says that people who practice this deserve death from God, since they're denying the reality that he clearly made. And often associated with foolishness is stubbornness, especially in the sense of being very anti-correction, as in hating to and rejecting, yielding to another's corrective teaching. Like someone can give you all the clear evidence, and you're like, nope, don't care, again, deny that reality. The second part of Proverbs 1:7 says that fools despise wisdom and instruction, and second part of 12:1 says that haters of reproof are stupid. And then also associated with foolishness is recklessness, which is a lack of regard for the danger or consequences of one's actions. And this sometimes takes the form of false courage, like brashness and brazenness. This is having a lack of wisdom. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. In other words, don't be reckless, be wise instead. And 2 Timothy 3:4 says, avoid reckless people. The sin of deceit is similar to foolishness. It is making to believe true what you know to be untrue for unjustified reasons. So it's like foolishness with the untruths, but you are constantly aware that it's untrue. And this includes so many things. It includes plagiarism, like even cheating on a test. It includes lying to kids. I mean, you can use euphemisms. You can just withhold information if they're too immature, not mature enough yet. But you don't have to lie to them, and like telling them Santa is a real existing being. And then deceit also includes so-called white lies. There's no such thing as a white lie. Exodus 20:16 says deceit is a violation of the 9th commandment. 1 Peter 2:1 says to put it away. Mark 7:22 mentions this like foolishness. 1 Timothy 1:10 says it's contrary to healthy doctrine. Proverbs 6:17 and 19 both say that God abhors it, so God abhors it twofold. 19:9 says that a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will perish. Romans 1:29 says people who live like this deserve death, and Revelation 22:8 says that they will also receive the second death, which is the burning lake. Deceit also includes perjury, which is specifically lying under oath. Leviticus 6:3 says that swearing falsely is a sin against God, and 19:12 says do not swear falsely by God's name, because then that's also blasphemy. And perjury is also mentioned in 1 Timothy 1:10. There's also defamation, which the written form is called libel. I'm emphasizing the sound. And then the verbal form is slander. I emphasize libel, so you don't think I'm saying liable. And this is the making of false claims about someone, almost always in order to ruin his or her reputation. First part of Exodus 23:1 says, "You shall not spread a false report." Colossians 3:8 says to put it away. 2 Timothy 3:3 says to avoid people who practice this. And then it's also mentioned in 1 Peter 2:1, Mark 7:22, and Romans 1:30. And then as well within deceit is fraudulence or swindling, where you are using deception or manipulation to trick someone into or out of something, such as tricking someone into paying more for something than what it's worth, or manipulating someone into doing something for you under false pretenses. Leviticus 6:2 says that deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposition or security, in other words, committing fraudulence, is a sin against God. And 1 Corinthians 6:10 say people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. The sin of flattery is falsely sincere, excessive, and sometimes untrue praise to someone for one's own interest. It's synonymous with puffery, which is puffing up another's ego for your own benefit. Psalm 12:3 says, "May the I am cut off all flattering lips." Ouch. The sins of ownership sins are a category of sins that center around the ownership/possession of something. So this includes like illegal possession and over-possessiveness. It also includes theft, which, as you know, is the taking possession of something you have no right to possess. Exodus 20:15 says it's a violation of the 8th commandment. Leviticus 19:11 and 13 each forbid theft and robbery. And 6:2 says that robbery is a sin against God. 1 Peter 4:15 says Christians shouldn't suffer as thieves. Mark 7:21 calls it an evil that defiles a person, and 1 Corinthians 6:10 says thieves won't inherit the kingdom. And theft is an action manifested out of covetousness or envy, which are also ownership sins and are most often confused. Now, covetousness, that is technically the strong desire for yourself to have something belonging to another. And Exodus 20:17 says it's a violation of the 10th commandment. Colossians 3:5 says to put it to death. Mark 7:22 says it's an evil that defiles a person. And Romans 1:29 says people who practice this deserve death from God. And then envy is actually strong desire for someone else to not have something that they do. So it's not necessarily you want yourself to have, but it's you want another to not have. 1 Peter 2:1 says to put it away. Galatians 5:21 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. Mark 7:22 mentions this as well, along with Romans 1:29. And 1 Corinthians 13:4 says it's contradictory to law. Sin of greed, aka avarice, is also an ownership sin and can manifest into theft. It is strong desire for material gain and possession, so i.e. earthly wealth, and what one does with it. The first part of 1 Timothy 6:10 says, quote, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils." 3:3 and 8 says ministers mustn't be greedy. 2 Timothy 3:2 says avoid greedy people. Proverbs, second part of 28:20 says whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. And 1 Corinthians 6:10 says greedy people won't inherit the kingdom. And greed includes parsimony or miserliness, which is extreme unwillingness to spend money or use resources, especially to do so in a generous way. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says to not give reluctantly or under compulsion. Luke 12:21 says that people who practice parsimony are not spiritually rich. And 1 John 3:17 indicates that God's love does not abide in parsimonious people. Also within greed is the almost opposite of extravagance, which is squandering, i.e. wasteful, reckless spending / using of resources. And the second part of Proverbs 21:20 says that fools spend whatever they get. As we call it today, burning a hole in your pocket. And this can take the form of ostentation, which is excessive vain displays in order to get attention, so i.e. wealth flashing, being all, oh, look at what I can afford. Yeah, dude, whatever. Jeremiah 9:23 says, thus says the I am, let not the rich man boast in his riches. Matthew 6:2 says to not stir up attention when you give, because that's what hypocrites do. And 1 Timothy 2:9 is all about not being obsessed and more focused on the outer appearance, but on the inner character. So in other words, don't be like Jesse Duplantis.
I live in the biggest house in the state of Louisiana.
Say it again.
I have the biggest house of any preacher in America.
Tell them what you named the house.
I have a name to my house, La Maison de Rêve, the house of dreams. You want to know how big it is?
Yes!
It's 40,000 square foot.
Yes!
It's not to show off.
The sin of man-stealing, word rarely used today, is wrongfully forcing someone to be your captive and or servant, or aiding such thing like by transporting stolen people. And so this encompasses kidnapping, holding people hostage, human trafficking, and all things slavery. Exodus 21:16 says that ancient Israel had the death penalty for anyone who stole a person, so illegally forcing them into slavery, for example, or sold such a person or was in possession of such a person. And 1 Timothy 1:10 says that all of this is contrary to healthy doctrine. The sin of intrusiveness is selfishly and inconsiderately not minding your own business, which is a big deal. First part of 1 Thessalonians 4:11 says to aspire to live quietly and mind your own affairs. And intrusiveness includes being a busybody, which is being excessively interested in a person's private affairs, which is called prying, and intrusive or unwarranted interference, which is called meddling. 2 Thessalonians 3:11 commands to not be a busybody. 1 Timothy 5:13 says busybodies say what they shouldn't. Proverbs 26:17 says whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears. In other words, you're doing the wrong thing, and so there are going to be consequences. You're going to get bit. And 1 Peter 4:15 says Christians shouldn't suffer as meddlers, and get bit. Intrusiveness also includes gossip, which is speaking about someone without them knowing and revealing private life details and or spreading rumors about that person. 1 Timothy 5:13 mentions this as well. The second part of Proverbs 25:9 says, do not reveal another's secrets. And Romans 1:29 says that gossips deserve death from God. And within gossip is detraction, which is revealing someone's real faults without a valid reason, and thereby belittling or disparaging one's reputation, worth, or esteem. So in other words, it's basically slander, but accurate. And so this includes things like backbiting. 1 Peter 2:1 says to put it away. Romans 1:30 says detractors deserve death from God. And 2 Corinthians 12:20, Paul says he wishes to not find this amongst the Corinthians when he visits them because it's a sin. The sin of betrayal is violating or wrongly annulling, that is, making void, an agreement, promise, or confidence/trust. 2 Timothy 3:4 says avoid betrayers, and Romans 1:31 says they deserve death from God. Betrayal includes disloyalty like treason, and it includes, now read the screen and listen to me very carefully, reneging with an E. Someone's going to clip that and it's not going to be good. This is to go back on a promise, undertaking, or contract. So it includes breaking/violating deals, unions, pacts, that's P-A-C-T-S, and covenants, such as a marital one. So adultery would be an example. The first part of Numbers 30, verse 2 says a man mustn't break his word, and Romans 1:31 mentions reneging as well. There is also conviction/conscience violation, which is to go against one's convictions or conscience, even if the thing they are doing isn't technically sinful. The second part of Romans 14:23 says, whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. And earlier in the verse, it gives an example of conviction violation, saying that if you eat meat, but while doing so truly believe that it is a sin, even though it objectively is not, you are still sinning because you are not acting in faith. The sin of unchastity, aka sexual immorality, is the largest branch we'll look at. It is any sort of violation of marriage and human sexuality. It's any sexual desire, thought, or action outside of the marital covenant between one man and one woman, i.e. one male and one female. Mark 7:21 says it's an evil that defiles a person. Colossians 3:5 says to put it to death. 1 Thessalonians 4:3 says, quote, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality. First part of 1 Corinthians 6:18 says to flee from it. Then verse 9, and Galatians 5:19 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. And Revelation 21:8 says people who practice this will have their part in the burning lake. So despite what culture says, it's a big deal. It involves lust, which is the thought of and desire for something unchaste. It is the nearly or absolutely always accompanying emotional precursor to it, and is therefore inward unchastity. Like how Matthew 5:28 says to look with lust is committing adultery in the heart. Unchastity includes lewdness, which is anything that is obscene, indecent, or vulgar, often with a sexual element to it. So it is any sensuality, it is any sexually explicit or merely suggestive behavior, imagery, or speech, such as showing too much skin without being entirely exposed. This is Also mentioned in Galatians 5:19, Mark 7:22 calls it an evil that defiles a person. Jude verse 4 says that condemned ungodly people pervert the grace of our God into sensuality. First part of Ephesians 4:29 says to let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. First part of 5:4 says to let there be no filthiness nor crude joking, which are out of place, and Colossians 3:8 says to put it away. Also within unchastity is polyamory, which is having multiple romantic relationships at once, like polygamy. 1 Corinthians 7:2, which is about the basic principles of marriage, solely refers to it as monogamous. As it says, each singular man should have his own singular wife, and each singular woman her own singular husband. There is no room for polygamy. 1 Timothy 3 verses 2 and 12 says that ministers mustn't be polyamorous, though some will argue that those verses are saying that a minister can't have had a previous wife, so therefore can't be a divorcee or widower, but that's just one interpretation. And then Genesis 2:24, one of the absolute most foundational verses of marriage, is, quote, therefore a singular man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his singular wife, and they shall become one flesh. Yes, the two shall become one flesh, not the one shall become one flesh with multiple. Sin of fornication also fits within unchastity. It is any sexual activity done outside of the marital covenant of one man and one woman. 1 Corinthians 7:9 says to get married so that you can have physical relations without earning hell, because otherwise you do earn hell with them. And it includes premarital sex. Also includes adultery, which is relations with someone you're not married to while you or the other person is married to another. Exodus 20:14 says it's a violation of the seventh commandment. Mark 7:21 says it's an evil that defiles a person. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. And Matthew 19:9, if you unjustifiably get divorced and then remarry and have relations in that new marriage, you're committing adultery, because if the divorce was unjustified, then in God's eyes, you're still married to that previous person. There's also non-heterosexuality, which is sexual activity with anyone who has the same Y chromosome status as you, meaning you and the other person both have a Y chromosome or both do not. New Testament verses 1 Timothy 1:10 says, men who lie in bed together are acting contrary to healthy doctrine. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says men who lie in bed together won't inherit the kingdom. Romans 1:26 and 27 says that men and women who desire non-heterosexuality have an unnatural, dishonorable passion. And first part of Jude verse 7 indicates that people who practice this deserve death from God, like other sins from earlier, like gossip. Not trying to pick on anyone in particular, trying to pick on everyone, including myself. And if you don't think these verses are talking about this, go see the West Huff video linked in the description. By the way, absolutely not advocating for the death of such people, nor anyone, since we all deserve death from God for other things. There is also non-consensual relations, which is relations with someone who does not or cannot reasonably consent, like a child or animal. Deuteronomy 22:25 says ancient Israel had the death penalty for rape. 1 Corinthians 7:2, like all verses and passages that deal with marriage, only ever refers to adults, so therefore marriage and the relations within it are only for adults. And Leviticus 18:23 says relations with an animal is an abomination. And finally, there's incest, which is relations with a relative close enough to have a much higher birth defect risk than with someone else, or someone that holds that position, i.e. a step or in-law relative. So like, for example, nowadays, to have a kid with your cousin, you have twice as much of a risk for birth defect than with, say, your fifth cousin, though this wasn't the case thousands of years ago, hence why it wasn't incest back then, but is now. Leviticus 18:6 says, "None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness," and verses 7 through 18 gives a list of those relatives at that time, which that list has grown over time with the increase in impurity in the human population gene pool. And then 1 Corinthians 5:1 says marrying your dad's wife, your step or biological mother, wasn't even tolerated amongst pagans around there at the time. The sin of denying gender, aka sex, is the last one we'll look at within unchastity, and it is denying what gender is, that it exists, and or what someone's gender is. Genesis 1:27 and 5:1 through 2 says that God made mankind in his image and in a gender binary. So to deny gender in any way is to deny how God made mankind and deny his image. This includes effeminacy, which is a man not being masculine but feminine instead. The specifics vary, but the principle is universal and applies the same to women not being feminine but trying to instead be masculine, which this can include tomboyishness if a woman is actively denying or rejecting her femininity. And again, specifics vary, but principle is universal. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. There's also transvestitism, which is wearing clothes that are physically and or socially designed for the opposite sex. No, I'm not saying women can't wear pants, nor men can't wear kilts, as I am Scottish. But women can't wear pants and shorts specifically designed for men, and men can't wear girly skirts and dresses. Deuteronomy 22:5 forbids this, and is not necessarily speaking in the ceremonial sense, since later in the chapter it talks about sexual morality like addressed earlier. And 1 Corinthians 11:14 and 15, Paul refers to a natural societal distinction between how a man looks and how a woman looks, which, again, specifics vary, but principle is universal. The sin of cussing, which, yes, it's a sin, is using certain words in an unbecoming, inappropriate way that has been deemed such by the majority of society. So specific word usage can vary amongst groups, but the principle is universal. The first part of Ephesians 4:29 says to let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. And 1 Corinthians 13:5 says being unbecoming is contrary to love. The sin of revelry is noisy, rowdy, rambunctious, all the synonyms, out of control festivities. And Galatians 5:21 says that people who practice this won't inherit the kingdom. Finally, the sins that are concomitant/associative are sins that are not standalone ones, but always accompany/associate with another sort of sin, any of which we have gone over. They include sinful/evil thoughts, which is thinking about committing a sin. Mark 7:21 says it's an evil that defiles a person. There's sin plotting, which is planning out how you're going to sin. Second part of Zechariah 7:10 says, let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. And first part of Proverbs 6:18 says that God abhors this. There's sin association, which is approving, promoting, or assisting a sin, like trying to tempt somebody to sin. Or this could be just being too chummy with sinners, namely heretics. The first part of Exodus 23:1 says, "You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness." Romans 1:32 talks about people approving of sins that deserve death from God, so they're guilty by association. First part of Psalm 1:1 says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." 1 Corinthians 5:11, which previously referenced, it says to not associate with false Christians who practice sin. And 2 Corinthians 6 says to not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, with people who live out sin. So this doesn't mean, you can't have any sort of relationships with such people. Scripture clearly does not say that, but you can't be too chummy. You can't be so friendly where they get the wrong impression and think like, oh, you're okay with this. There is sin invention, which is creating new ways to sin. Some examples include cyberbullying, so bullying, but now with technology, sexual immoral videos, again, now with technology, so-called gender-changing surgery, and new false beliefs. And Romans 1:30 says that people who practice this deserve death from God. And finally, there is payback, which is sinning against another for sinning against you. Like, for example, your spouse committed adultery against you, now you're going to commit adultery against them. Sorry, you can't do that. Romans 12 verses 17 and 19 say, "Don't repay evil with evil or avenge yourself, since vengeance belongs to God. And trust me, no one can revenge like God." And finally, this is not a sin.
If you're happy and you know it, that's a sin. If you're happy and you know it, that's a sin. Where's
An hour 20.